Margaret Calloway found it on her third night in Cimarron. She wasn't snooping. She'd gone to the barn for a lantern, that was all. But when she lifted the canvas in the far corner, her hand stopped. Her breath stopped. A cedar cradle sat in the darkness, hand-carved, sanded smooth as water, beautiful enough to break your heart. She stood there shaking, because she understood immediately. This man had built it for a child that wasn't coming. And no one in this town had ever bothered to ask him why. If you're watching from anywhere in this country, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you stay until the very end, you're going to understand why the most dangerous man in New Mexico territory turned out to be the only safe one. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part, because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. The stagecoach door swung open, and Margaret Calloway stepped down into Cimarron dust, wearing a dress washed so many times the blue had gone to gray, and a wedding ring she'd put on by proxy 3 weeks ago in a lawyer's office in Independence, Missouri, with no one present except her daughters and a notary who hadn't bothered to look up from his papers. She didn't know the man she'd married. She knew his handwriting. She knew he owned land. She knew his name was Eli Holt, and that his sister Dorothy had written on his behalf because, in Dorothy's careful words, "My brother is better with his hands than with words, and the advertisement was my idea, not his." That was enough. It had to be. "Stay close," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Mama, it smells like horses and something burning," Lily announced from Maggie's hip. "I know, sweet. Is that normal?" "For New Mexico, I think so." She sat Lily down and took her hand and stood still for one moment on that platform. Because she had learned in the last 2 years that the first thing you did in a new place mattered. You either let the place decide what you were, or you decided first. She lifted her chin. She looked at the town. The town looked back. A cluster of women near the mercantile went quiet in the specific way that meant they'd been talking and had simply paused, not stopped. 2 men outside the saloon assessed her with flat western eyes. Not threatening, just measuring. A dog crossed the street without hurrying. Everything in Cimarron moved like it had decided long ago that urgency was a waste of energy. Then she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, and the reason she noticed him first was the same reason she'd learned to notice certain men in a room. He was the only one not looking at her. Eli Holt had his back half turned, one boot up on the lowest rail of the hitching post, talking in a low voice to the deputy beside him. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who hadn't built that through vanity, but through work. Dark hair that needed cutting, jaw that needed shaving, hands wrapped around a tin cup that looked breakable in those hands, like he'd forgotten he was holding it. He couldn't have been more than 38. She'd expected older. Dorothy's letter had made him sound like a man past the point of wanting anything, and Maggie had prepared herself for someone worn down to the bone. This man wasn't worn down. He was held in. There was a difference. "Mrs. Calloway?" The station master consulted his paper. "You have someone meeting you?" "Eli Holt," she said. The station master's expression did something complicated that he smoothed over quickly. Not quick enough. She didn't need him to go get anyone, because in the moment her name crossed that platform, Eli Holt turned around. Their eyes met across 30 feet of open air, and Maggie had the precise, cold sensation of stepping onto river ice in early spring. The kind that might hold and might not, and you won't know until you're already committed. He said nothing. He handed the tin cup to the deputy, said something short, and walked toward her. Not fast, not slow. The walk of a man who had decided somewhere along the way that the world moved at whatever pace it moved at, and fighting that fact only wore you out. He stopped 6 feet away, looked at her, looked at Clara, looked at Lily. Lily looked back at him with a complete, unfiltered assessment that only 6-year-olds can deliver. Head tilted, eyes wide. A small person running a full inspection, with no awareness that this might be impolite. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. Low voice, unhurried. "Mr. Holt." "These are your girls." "Clara?" She touched her older daughter's shoulder. "And Lily." Clara nodded with the seriousness of a small diplomat. Lily stuck out her hand and announced, "I'm Lily Grace Calloway, and I'm 6 years old, and I can already read some words." Something moved across Eli Holt's face. Quick. Contained. He bent and shook her offered hand like she was a business associate whose time he respected. "Pleased to meet you, Lily Grace." "You're very tall." "I've been told." "Do you have horses?" "I do." "How many?" "Lily," Maggie said. "I'm gathering information, Mama." "4 horses," Eli said. 2 working, 1 old, 1 young, and still stupid. Lily considered this with great scientific seriousness. "Can I meet the stupid one?" "Tomorrow." "Promise?" "Lily," Maggie began. "Yes," Eli said simply. He straightened, looked back at Maggie. "Wagon's ready." That was all. No welcome speech, no reassurance, no attempt to soften the strangeness of 2 strangers meeting for the first time after agreeing by mail to share a life. He picked up both bags without asking, turned, and walked. Maggie picked up Lily, took Clara's hand, and followed. She heard it as they crossed the platform. She always heard it. Women's voices, pitched low but engineered to carry. "That's her, the one from Missouri." "Lord, did you hear what her husband did?" And then the one that landed like a hand around her throat. Eli Holt, of all the men. She has no idea what she's walking into. Maggie kept walking. Clara's hand tightened in hers. Maggie squeezed back once, firm, deliberate, and felt Clara relax by a fraction. She had taught herself not to respond to gossip. Responding fed it. But what she had never been able to teach herself was how to stop hearing it. 2 years of it in Independence. Every market, every church, every street corner. James Calloway's widow. James Calloway's fool wife who didn't know. James Calloway's children who carried his name like a brand. She was so tired of hearing it. She was so tired. But she kept her head up. She kept walking, because her daughters were watching, and that was the only reason she ever needed. The wagon was solid and practical, built for work, not show. Eli loaded the bags with quick, efficient movements and helped the girls up without ceremony. Steady hands, no fuss, no performance of helpfulness. When he offered his hand to Maggie, she took it, and she felt work-scarred palms and a grip that was careful not to be too firm, like a man who had learned that his own strength could be alarming and had adjusted accordingly. She let go the moment her feet found the seat. They rode in silence for the first mile. The land opened wide, mountains in the distance, blue and enormous. Sky that went on too long, longer than sky had a right to. Beautiful in the way that unforgiving things are beautiful. You could admire it and still understand it would kill you, without caring. "They know about my husband," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "What exactly do they say?" He was quiet a moment, deciding how honest to be. Then, that he ran a land scheme out of Independence, took money from families that couldn't afford to lose it, had a heart attack before they could charge him, and left you holding a name nobody wanted to be associated with. She kept her voice flat. posted the advertisement. And you sent the letter anyway. I wasn't looking for a woman without a past, he said. I was looking for someone who needed a fresh start, as bad as I needed one. She turned to look at his profile. He kept his eyes on the road. My husband was a liar, she said carefully. I didn't know until the end. I want you to be clear on that. I believe you. You don't know me well enough. I know what a woman looks like when she's been lied to by someone she trusted. Still looking at the road, no drama in his voice, just fact. It doesn't look like guilt. It looks like what's on your face right now. The words hit somewhere behind her sternum. She turned away before he could see what they did to her. In the wagon bed, Lily had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder. Clara stared at the mountains with those careful, measuring eyes that made her look 40 years old and 9 at the same time. Clara, who had stopped asking for things 18 months ago. Clara, who set the table without being asked and never complained about anything, and watched every adult in every room with the focused attention of a child who had learned that adults contained surprises, and that surprises were usually bad. James Calloway's real damage wasn't the debt, wasn't the ruined name. It was what he'd done to his daughter's understanding of the world. That was what Maggie could not forgive. That was what she carried heavier than anything else. That one, Eli said quietly, nodding toward Clara. Yes. She's carrying something too heavy for a 9-year-old. The accuracy of it landed like a fist to the chest. Maggie breathed through it. I know. Kids her age need to be told it's not their job to hold everything together. I've told her. Might need to be shown. By someone she's not responsible for protecting. She looked at him sharply. He kept his eyes on the road, expression unchanged, like he'd said something ordinary. She wanted to argue. She couldn't, because he was right. Clara didn't believe Maggie's reassurances because Clara spent every waking hour worrying about Maggie. What her daughter needed was someone outside that equation. She didn't say any of this. She stored it. The ranch appeared as the sun went low. A shallow valley, a creek behind, a barn in better repair than the house. The house was small. 2 windows, a sagging porch step, a door that needed rehanging. But the fencing was new. The well looked solid. The garden plot behind the house had been turned and was waiting, patient as an open hand. Someone had prepared it for planting. Someone had cleared it and turned it and left it ready before she arrived. It's not much, Eli said. It's more than we had a month ago, Maggie said. And she meant it plainly, not as gratitude, just as fact. He seemed to hear it that way. He nodded. He helped the girls down. Lily woke immediately and launched into questions about the horses. He answered each one with the same unhurried patience. Yes, you can meet the young one tomorrow. No, you can't feed them your supper. Yes, they do have names. No, Ranger didn't name himself. How did he get named Ranger then? Lily demanded. That's a long story. I like long stories. Tomorrow, he said again. You say that a lot. Most things worth knowing take more than one day, he said, and Lily stared at him with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected piece of wisdom and not being entirely sure what to do with it. Clara said nothing. Clara watched everything. He opened the house door and stepped back to let them through. Inside, clean, spare, functional. 1 bed, 2 mismatched chairs, a stove scrubbed to a shine, shelves with tin plates, a few books, a coffee tin. The floor swept. Curtainless windows, the glass wavy and old. 1 bed. Maggie had known this was coming. She'd steeled herself for it on the stagecoach. But the reality of it, The single wool blanket, the careful right-angle corners, was different from the abstract. "The girls will want the loft," Eli said, not looking at her. "Matter of fact, I had it ready last week." Maggie climbed the ladder and stopped at the top. 2 pallets, 2 wool blankets, folded at the foot. A lantern hung from a rafter nail. And on the windowsill of the loft, where the last light was catching them just so, 2 small carved figures, a horse and a dog. Rough made, clearly deliberate, left there by someone who had thought about 2 little girls arriving in a strange place and wanted something to meet them. "Mama?" Clara said from behind her, voice barely above a whisper. "He made those. They were just there." Maggie pressed her hand against the wall. She breathed. She would not cry. She was not going to cry in front of her daughters over 2 small carved animals left on a windowsill by a man she'd known for 4 hours. She breathed. She breathed again. "Come on," she said, voice steady. "Let's get your blankets sorted." She cooked supper with what was in the larder: salt pork, potatoes, coffee so strong it was almost a solid. And by the time the food was on the table, the lamps were lit and the outside dark had gone completely dark. Eli came in from the barn, washed his hands, sat without ceremony. They ate, 4 people at a table set for 4, in a silence that was not warm but was at least honest. Lily ate everything and declared the potatoes acceptable. Clara ate carefully and watched Eli over the rim of her cup with those measuring eyes. Eli ate without drama, drank his coffee in 3 swallows, and set his cup down. "You want to talk terms," he said. Maggie looked up. "I do." "Girls," he looked at Lily, then Clara. "You want to go see if that horse I mentioned is in the near corral? Don't open the gate. Just look." Lily was off her chair before he finished the sentence. Clara hesitated. That particular Clara hesitation. The pause of a child checking whether it was safe to want something. Then followed. The door shut. Silence. "Go ahead," Eli said. Maggie folded her hands on the table. She had prepared this. She had rehearsed it on the stagecoach, in the lawyer's office, in every sleepless night for 3 weeks. "I need to know what you expect from this arrangement. What my role is. What happens to my daughters if something happens to me. And I need to know—" She stopped, reset. "I need to know what happened that made a man post an advertisement for a stranger instead of finding someone he already knew." Eli was quiet for a long moment. "Last question first," he said. "There's no one I already know who'd come out here. I've made certain of that." He said it without self-pity, just accuracy. "Why?" He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "I made some choices people in this town didn't forgive. Not bad choices, but choices that cost me." His jaw tightened, once. "I'll tell you the full story when I trust you enough to tell it right. But the short version is, I have a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army, and there's a man in this town, Deputy Vance McAllister, who has been using that fact to call my character into question for 3 years while he quietly works to take this land." "Take it how?" "False debt claims, sheriff's notices based on testimony he's bought and paid for." His voice was level, but something moved underneath it, cold and certain. "My ranch sits on the only reliable water source in the Eastern Valley. He wants it. He's been patient, and he's been smart, and so far he hasn't managed it." The look he gave her was direct. "But he'll come after you. I want you to know that before he does." "Come after me how?" "He'll be kind. He'll be concerned. He'll tell you things about me designed to make you question whether you're safe here." Eli's eyes held hers. "He'll offer you money, or help, or a way out. He'll frame it as looking out for you and your daughters. And is he right? Am I safe here? The question sat between them. Yes, Eli said. No hesitation, no performance. You are. How do I know that? You don't yet. You'll have to watch and decide. He paused. That's honest. She looked at him for a moment. She had sat across tables from men her entire life. She had sat across a table from James Calloway for 11 years and watched him lie to her with a smile on his face every single day and never seen it. She had told herself afterward that she simply wasn't good at reading people, that her instincts were broken, that she could not trust her own judgment. But something in her, something stubborn and battered and not quite dead, looked at Eli Holt across this plain wooden table and said, "This man is not lying to you right now." "There's something else," Eli said. His voice had changed. Quieter, more careful. She waited. In the barn, he looked at the table rather than her. Far corner, under a canvas. I started building it 4 years ago. A cedar cradle. He was quiet. I was going to be married. She came out here, heard what people said about me, and left inside of a week. I kept building it after she left. Another pause. Longer. I don't entirely know why. Stubbornness, maybe. Or I didn't want to let go of the idea that this place could be something besides just work and silence. Maggie sat very still. "I'm telling you because you'll find it eventually," he said. "And I'd rather it came from me." She said nothing for a moment. What was her name? He looked up, slightly surprised by the question. Eleanor. Did you love her? I thought I could. He was quiet. I think I loved what she represented more than who she was. I didn't know her well enough for more than that. And the cradle, Maggie said carefully. You've kept it. Under canvas, he said, in the corner. He met her eyes. I'm not a man who throws things away. Outside, Lily's laugh broke the night air, high and clear. Clara's voice followed, lower, surprised. And then silence again. Eli and Maggie both turned toward the window without thinking. She laughed, Maggie said softly. Clara had laughed. Horse probably did something stupid, Eli said. She doesn't laugh much anymore. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not measuring, not assessing. Something different. Something that recognized what it was looking at because it had seen it in a mirror. No, he said quietly. I don't imagine she does. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Less empty. I need to ask you something, Maggie said. Ask. Those carvings in the loft. The horse and the dog. He said nothing. You put them there before we arrived. Still nothing, but she watched his jaw shift. You thought about two little girls coming to a strange place, she said, and you wanted there to be something there to meet them. Her voice was steady. She had worked hard to keep it steady. That wasn't in any letter. That wasn't part of the arrangement. You just did it. Eli Holt looked at the table. A long moment passed. Seemed like the right thing, he said finally. She nodded once. She stood, collected the plates, and began washing them at the basin. He stayed at the table, and she could feel him deciding whether to say something else or let it go. He let it go. That, she thought, was also the right thing. The girls came back in, pink-cheeked and trailing cold air. Lily announced that the young horse had sneezed directly on Clara's sleeve, and it was the funniest thing she had ever seen in her life. Clara, to Maggie's complete astonishment, agreed. She put them to bed, climbed the ladder with Lily drowsy in her arms, tucked blankets, kissed foreheads, listened to Clara's careful, even breathing until it deepened into sleep. She came back down. Eli was spreading his bedroll near the stove. He looked up. "You don't have to sleep on your floor," she said. "I know." "There's room." "I know." He said it without edge.
"But we don't know each other yet, Mrs. Calloway, and I'm not a man who takes things that haven't been offered." He settled onto the bedroll, arms behind his head. "Good night." She stood in the center of that small room, a stranger's home, a stranger's floor, a stranger's tin cups and sparse shelves, and life built to accommodate one person and now holding four. She lay down on the bed. Above her, her daughters breathed in sleep. Across the room, Eli Holt lay on his floor, with his eyes closed and his hands folded. A man who could have taken more than he did and chose not to. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about a cedar cradle under canvas, about a man who kept building it after the woman he'd planned it for left him standing in the dust, about hands that carved small horses and placed them on windowsills for children who hadn't arrived yet. She thought about James Calloway, who had smiled at her every day and lied with every breath. She thought about the difference. She did not sleep for a long time, but for the first time in 2 years, what was keeping her awake was not fear of what tomorrow would bring. It was something she hadn't felt in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning of trust. And across the room, just before she finally closed her eyes, she heard Eli Holt's breathing deepen into sleep. Steady, even, present. And the sound of it, that simple human sound of someone nearby, filled a silence in her she hadn't known was still bleeding. Outside, the New Mexico night pressed against the windows. Inside, something fragile had been placed on a table between two people who had both lost everything. Neither of them knew yet whether it would hold. Morning came hard and fast in Cimarron, the kind of cold that didn't ask permission before it got into the cabin through every gap in the logs. Maggie was awake before the light, which was nothing new. She hadn't slept past 5 in 2 years. She lay still for a moment in the gray dark, listening to her daughters breathe in the loft above and to the silence on the other side of the room where Eli had slept. And she waited for the particular dread that had greeted her every morning in Independence. That cold, heavy thing that settled on her chest the moment consciousness arrived and reminded her of everything that was wrong. It didn't come. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She got up, built the fire, started coffee. The bedroll near the stove had been folded and stacked in the corner with military precision. Eli was already gone. She could hear him in the barn. The low, steady sounds of a man doing familiar work. The particular rhythm of someone who had been doing the same tasks alone for so long, they'd become a kind of language he spoke only to himself. She stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a cup and watched the barn door and told herself she was not waiting for him to come back in. Clara appeared at the top of the ladder, hair loose, boots already on. "Mama." "Morning, baby." "Lily's still asleep." "Let her sleep." Maggie turned from the window. "Come have coffee." "I don't drink coffee." "Come have something warm and sit with me." Clara came down the ladder with her careful, measured steps and accepted a cup of hot water with a spoonful of the dried apple Maggie had found in the larder. She sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at Maggie with those old eyes of hers. "He was already gone when I woke up," Clara said. "He works early." "Does that mean he was in here last night? Sleeping on the floor?" "Yes." Clara thought about that. "He gave us the only bed." Another silence. Clara turned the cup in slow circles.
Mama, is this going to be like last time? When we thought the Hendersons were going to let us stay, and then they didn't? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Maggie sat down across from her daughter. This is different. How? Because this is legal. This is a marriage. He can't change his mind the way the Hendersons could. But what if he wants to? Maggie looked at her eldest daughter, 9 years old and already constructing escape routes in her head before she'd even finished unpacking. I don't think he wants to, she said carefully. But I know that's not enough for you. You need to watch and decide for yourself. And that's all right. She reached across and covered Clara's hand with her own. Take your time. You don't have to trust him today. Clara looked at their hands. Then she said, quietly, He carved those animals for us, before we even got here. I know. Papa never did things like that.
The word Papa sat in the room between them like something still warm from the fire. Maggie felt it move through her chest, sharp and then dull. James Calloway had not been a man who thought about what other people needed before they arrived. He had been a man who thought about what other people had and how to acquire it. Those were different things, and Clara, at 9 years old, had understood the difference better than Maggie had at 32. No, Maggie said. He didn't. The barn door opened, and Eli came across the yard. He knocked twice before opening the house door, which was something Maggie had not expected, a man knocking at his own door, and came in bringing cold air and the smell of horses and fresh hay. Coffee? Maggie asked. Please. He washed his hands, sat down, accepted the cup. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. Two people conducting a mutual assessment with complete seriousness. Horse sleep all right? Clara asked. Something moved at the corner of Eli's mouth. Ranger always sleeps all right. It's his primary talent. What about the young one, the stupid one? His name is Dust, and he slept fine too, once he stopped trying to get into the feed bin. How did he try to get into it? With his nose, mostly, then his forehead. Then he just stood there looking at it like it might open on its own if he waited long enough. Clara almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but Maggie saw it gathering at the corners of her daughter's mouth, the way weather gathered at the edge of the mountains. Not arrived yet, but coming. That does seem stupid, Clara said. I've known men who tried the same approach, Eli said, and drank his coffee. Lily descended the ladder 20 minutes later like a small hurricane, announcing she was hungry, that she dreamed about the horse, and that she needed to know if there were eggs because she wanted to see where eggs came from. Eli told her eggs came from the 3 hens in the yard, that she could collect them after breakfast, and that she should not, under any circumstances, try to explain this process to the hens. Why not? Lily demanded. They already know. Oh. Lily absorbed this. That makes sense. They ate. 4 people at a table set for 4. And this morning, the silence between them was different. Not empty, not wary, just quiet in the way of people who don't yet have enough shared history for conversation to be easy, but have enough of something else to make the silence bearable. Maggie was washing the breakfast plates when the sound of a horse in the yard made Eli go still across the room. It was a particular kind of stillness, not fear, the opposite of fear. The deliberate, controlled settling of a man who needed a moment to decide what version of himself was going to walk out that door. She turned. His face had closed like a shutter pulled across a window. Stay inside, he said, not unkindly, and went out. She did not stay inside. She moved to the window and she watched, and Clara appeared at her elbow without being asked, because Clara had spent the last 2 years learning to be exactly where information was. The man dismounting in the yard was perhaps 45, and the first thing you noticed about him was that he took up more space than his body required. He was not large, but he moved like a man who had decided long ago that whatever room he walked into was his room, and had been correct about this often enough to have stopped questioning it. He wore a deputy's badge on a clean coat and a smile that had been manufactured specifically for this occasion. "Eli!" His voice carried through the glass, pleasant and practiced. "Heard you had company arrive." "Deputy McAllister." Eli stood on his porch step, hands loose at his sides. "What brings you out?" "Just being neighborly. Wanted to welcome your new wife to the territory." He looked toward the window, and Maggie had the clear, cold certainty that he had known she was there before he looked. "Ma'am," he touched his hat. "Deputy Vance McAllister. I run law and order in Cimarron, among other responsibilities." Maggie stepped out onto the porch because she would not be watched through glass like something behind a counter. "Mrs. Calloway," she said. "Holt now, I suppose." "Indeed," McAllister smiled. It was a good smile, the kind built from long practice in front of people who needed to be reassured. "How are you finding the territory?" "Fine so far." "I'm glad to hear it." He shifted his gaze to Eli, with the ease of a man changing directions in water. "I was hoping we might have a word about the Hendricks water easement. There's a filing at the land office that concerns your east fence line." "I'm familiar with it," Eli said. "It was resolved last spring." There seems to be some question about that resolution." McAllister reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "New affidavit. Tom Hendricks claims the agreement was verbal, not written, which means under territorial law." "I have the written agreement," Eli said. "Signed and witnessed." "Of course you do." The smile didn't waver. "I'm sure it'll all work out. I just wanted to make sure you were aware, given that you have—" His eyes moved to Maggie with a gentleness so deliberate it made her skin tighten. "Additional responsibilities now. A family to consider. It might be worth asking yourself whether a prolonged legal dispute is the best use of your resources at this particular time." The silence that followed was shaped. Maggie looked at McAllister and understood him completely in that moment. Not because he was doing anything dramatic, because he was doing nothing dramatic. He was standing in a yard on a mild morning and delivering a threat wrapped so carefully in concern that if you described this conversation to someone later, it would sound like a courtesy call. She had lived with James Calloway for 11 years. She knew exactly how this worked. "Deputy McAllister," she said. He turned to her with that assembled smile. "I appreciate you riding out," she said pleasantly. "I'm sure that affidavit will turn out to be exactly what my husband says it is, and I'm sure a man in your position values accurate record-keeping." She held his gaze. "I know I do." Something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, something more careful than anger. A reassessment. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Well, I won't keep you." He mounted his horse with the movements of a man performing a casual exit that he had fully planned in advance. "Eli? Mrs. Holt?" He touched his hat again. "Welcome to Cimarron." He rode out. Eli watched him go. The stillness didn't leave his body until the sound of hooves faded. Then he exhaled, just once, controlled, and turned to look at her. She looked back. "You didn't stay inside," he said. "No." "I noticed." "He wasn't going to say anything different with me out here than with me in there," she said. "Except that with me out here, he had to say it to my face." Eli was quiet a moment. Then, "You've dealt with men like him before." "I was married to one for 11 years. She said it flat, without drama. "I know how they work. They use your love or your fear or your need, whichever one is most available. McAllister is using your isolation. He's betting that a man alone doesn't have enough weight to push back." She paused.
He didn't account for you not being alone anymore." Eli looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. There was something in it that wasn't gratitude exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific look of a man who has been fighting something by himself for so long, he has forgotten what it feels like to have someone stand beside him. He didn't say anything. He went back inside, and she followed him, and neither of them spoke about McAllister again that morning. But the shape of the conversation stayed in the room the way weather stays in your bones after you've come in from the cold. The afternoon went quietly. Eli worked. Maggie organized the kitchen, took stock of what they had and what they needed, made a list in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Lily collected eggs with intense concentration and came back with 4 of them intact, and a 5th that had not survived the journey. Clara spent an hour near the corral fence watching Dust, the young horse, do nothing in particular, and Maggie watched her daughter watch that horse and felt something loosen in her chest. It was late afternoon when Clara came inside and found Maggie at the table with the account book. "Mama?" "He showed me how to give them hay." Clara sat across from her. "Without going in the corral. He showed me how to push it through the fence so they can reach it." Maggie looked up. "He showed me where to put my hands so Ranger doesn't accidentally bite my fingers," Clara continued, with the careful precision of a child, reporting facts rather than feelings. "He said Ranger wouldn't do it on purpose, but sometimes horses don't pay attention." "That was good of him." "He didn't make a big thing of it," Clara said. "He just showed me, like it was normal." Maggie held her daughter's eyes. "Is that okay?" Clara considered the question with her customary gravity. "I think so." She looked at the table. "He talks to them, the horses. When he doesn't think anyone is listening, he talks to them." He told Ranger that the new family had arrived, and that Ranger needed to behave because the little one was only 6, and she had enough to deal with. The words went through Maggie like something warm and sudden. "He said that?" "About Lily, yes." Clara looked up. "He said it quietly, but I was close to the fence and I heard." She paused. "I don't think he knows I heard." Maggie looked at her daughter and said nothing. Because sometimes the thing that needed to happen was nothing. Just the space for Clara to sit with what she'd found and decide what to do with it at her own pace, in her own time, without anyone telling her what it meant. That evening, after supper, Eli brought in a piece of wood from the barn and sat near the stove and began to whittle. His hands moved with the focused ease of someone doing something that came as naturally as breathing. Lily climbed onto the chair beside him and watched with enormous eyes. "What's it going to be?" she asked. "Don't know yet." "How can you not know? You're the one making it." "Sometimes you start with the wood, and the wood tells you what it wants to be." Lily stared at the piece of wood with intense suspicion. "That doesn't make any sense." "It will," he said, "when you've made enough things." Clara was across the room pretending to read, which meant she was listening to every word. Maggie washed the supper dishes and watched the 3 of them in the lamplight. Lily talking, Eli carving, Clara pretending not to care. And she felt something move through her that she recognized even though she'd spent 2 years trying to burn it out, because hope had cost her so much the last time she'd let it in. She pushed it back down. It was too early. She was too practical, too careful, too aware of how quickly things that looked solid could turn out to be hollow. But it moved through her anyway, stubborn as creek water finding its way around rock. After the girls were in the loft and asleep, Maggie sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold, and Eli sat across from her, and they had the kind of silence that no longer needed to be filled. Then he said,
McAllister will come back. I know. The water easement is the opening argument, not the whole case. What he really wants is to establish a legal pattern. Small disputes that he controls the resolution of, that put my name on paperwork connected to his paperwork, until eventually there's enough of it that when he moves for the land itself, it looks like a continuation of existing disputes rather than a grab. Maggie looked at him. You understand law. I've had 3 years to study how he works. Something moved in his jaw. I've watched him do it to 4 other families in this valley. Pick them off one at a time. They didn't have the money to fight or the standing to be heard. You have standing? Some. Less since the discharge. He was quiet a moment. I have a friend, Thomas Bear Runner, Comanche, lives north of the ridge. He knows this land better than anyone alive, and he knows things about McAllister's land dealings that McAllister doesn't know he knows. He stopped, looked at her carefully. I'm going to need to ride north and talk to him soon. That means leaving you and the girls here for 2, maybe 3 days. The air in the room changed. I'll be fine, Maggie said. I know you will. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when I go, and so you know why. He met her eyes. I don't leave without explaining. I don't make decisions that affect this household without telling you first. She absorbed that, the plainness of it, the total absence of performance. How soon? She asked. A week, maybe 2. I want McAllister to settle back down first. Stop watching the place so close. He pushed his chair back. But before I go, I need you to know where everything is. The deed, the written agreement, the cash I keep in the floorboard near the stove, the rifle, and where the ammunition is. Everything. You're going to tell me where your money is, she said slowly. After 9 days. After 9 days, he confirmed. She looked at this man, this careful, deliberate, unhurried man who would knock on his own door that morning, who talked to horses about 6-year-old girls, who had carved 2 small animals and left them on a windowsill for children he'd never met. Eli, she said. He looked up. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is difficult. All right? The dishonorable discharge. She kept her voice steady. What did you do? He was still for a moment. Then he looked at the table, and she watched something cross his face that was not shame, but was the thing that lives next to shame in a man who has made peace with the right kind of wrong. I disobeyed a direct order, he said. I rode ahead of a military column, and I warned a Comanche camp we were coming. He looked up. Got most of them out. Not all. The pause carried the specific weight of not all. Then I came back and told my commanding officer exactly what I'd done and why. Maggie said nothing. They asked me to say I'd gotten lost, disoriented, that it was a mistake in navigation, not a choice. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. I told them it was a choice. Told them I'd make it again. He held her eyes. So they gave me the discharge, and I came home and McAllister's been using it as a crowbar ever since. The room was very quiet. You traded your reputation, she said softly, to save people you didn't have to save. I knew them, he said simply. You don't watch people you know get killed because it's convenient not to. Something shifted in Maggie Calloway's chest. Deep down, in the place that James Calloway had convinced her was broken beyond repair. The place that was supposed to know the difference between a man who would and a man who wouldn't. It didn't feel broken anymore. She stood, collected the cups, stood at the basin with her back to him. She was not going to let him see her face right now. She was not ready for him to see what was happening on her face. Get some sleep, she said, voice controlled. You've got an early start tomorrow. I do, he agreed. She heard him settle onto the bedroll. She heard the lamp wick turn down, She stood at the basin in the near dark and breathed slowly and told herself to be careful, to be practical, to be the woman who had survived 2 years of nothing by being careful and practical. But her hands were shaking slightly when she dried them on the cloth, and when she finally lay down in the darkness, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of Eli Holt's even breathing across the room. And she thought about a man who had given up everything for a choice he would make again. And she thought about a cedar cradle under canvas in a barn she had not yet let herself go back to look at. She had told herself she would not look at it again until she was ready. She was beginning to think ready might come sooner than she'd planned. The shaking in her hands was gone by morning, replaced by the particular steadiness that comes not from having resolved anything, but from having decided to keep moving anyway. Maggie had made that decision so many times in the last 2 years, it had become less a choice and more a reflex, like breathing. You woke up, you built the fire, you kept going. What was different this morning was that when she turned from the stove, Eli was already at the table with the account book she'd been working through the night before, and he was reading it. Not going through her things, she'd left it open on the table, but reading it with his full attention, the way a man reads something that matters. She set his coffee down without a word. He looked up. "You're good at this." "I kept my husband's books for 8 years before I understood what he was actually doing with the money." "That's not what I mean." He turned the book so she could see what he was looking at. "You found the discrepancy in the feed costs. 3 months of overcharging from the Cimarron Mercantile. I'd been paying it without catching it." She sat down. 15 cents per sack over what the posted price should be. Small enough not to notice month to month. Large enough to add up. That's $37 over the year. Closer to 40 if you go back 18 months. She pulled the book toward her. "I went back through what receipts you had saved." He was quiet a moment. "Harlan Briggs owns that mercantile." "Does Harlan Briggs have any connection to McAllister?" The look on his face answered her before he did. "He's McAllister's wife's cousin." Maggie nodded slowly. "So, he overcharges you quietly, skims the difference, and if you ever push back, McAllister has a reason to step in on a dispute. Make you look difficult, unreasonable. You got all that from a feed receipt? I got all that from knowing how men like that think." She closed the book. "You need a different supplier, or you need to walk into that mercantile with the posted price list and the receipts and make Harlan Briggs explain the difference to your face, publicly, in front of whoever happens to be shopping." Eli looked at her across the table for a moment. Something in his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, just a degree, the way a door that has been shut a long time shifts when something on the other side finally applies the right kind of pressure. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "A woman who needed help," he said. "Not a woman who showed up and immediately started fixing things." "I do need help," she said plainly. "My daughters need a roof and food and a place that isn't moving. I need—" She paused, and it cost her something to say the next part, because she had gotten very good at needing nothing from anyone. "I need someone I can rely on. That's real." She met his eyes. "But needing help doesn't mean being helpless. Those are different things." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are." Lily appeared at the top of the ladder and announced she was awake and hungry and have Eli already fed Dust because she wanted to help feed Dust. Eli told her Dust had been fed, but that there was still the matter of the hens if she was interested. Lily descended the ladder with the energy of a small person who had slept 10 hours and considered this perfectly acceptable. And the morning moved forward, the way mornings do when there was work to be done and children to be fed, and no space for the things that need more time than a morning allows. Clara came down last, quiet and watchful as always, and took her place at the table and ate her breakfast and said almost nothing. But Maggie noticed that when Eli passed her the bread without being asked, because he'd already noted that Clara always took bread and always hesitated before asking for it. Clara's hand closed around it without hesitation, without the pause. That small thing. Maggie filed it away and said nothing about it. It was the second week when Ruth Decker came. Maggie was hanging laundry when the buggy came up the road. A good buggy, the kind that announced its owner's position before the owner had to say a word. The woman who stepped down was perhaps 50, dressed in the careful way of someone who had come from nothing and wore their current circumstances like armor. Her face was pleasant, and her eyes were not. "Mrs. Holt," she extended her hand. "Ruth Decker. My husband runs the bank in Cimarron. I've been meaning to come welcome you to the territory." Maggie dried her hands on her apron and shook. Ruth's grip was precise. The grip of a woman who had learned exactly how firm was appropriate and practiced it until it was automatic. "Mrs. Decker, would you like coffee?" "I wouldn't want to impose. It's already made." They sat at the table, Maggie and Ruth Decker, and Maggie poured coffee and waited while Ruth arranged herself in the chair with the small adjustments of a woman about to deliver a prepared speech and trying to make it look spontaneous. "I'll be honest with you," Ruth said. In Maggie's experience, that sentence was almost always the beginning of a dishonesty. But she kept her face open and her hands still and said, "Please." The women in town, the ones who matter, the ones who have established families and standing, they're willing to give you a fair chance, a clean start. But there are concerns. Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. About Eli. About what it means for you and your daughters to be associated with his situation. His situation. The discharge, the ongoing disputes with the deputy, Ruth paused, choosing her next words with the precision of a woman who had been thinking about this conversation for days. The questions about his temperament. His history of conflict. "What history of conflict?" Maggie asked, pleasantly. "He's had disagreements with half the established ranchers in this valley, over water rights that belong to him, over his version of where those rights begin and end." Ruth's eyes held hers. "I'm not saying he's a bad man. I'm saying he's a difficult one. And a woman in your position, alone, with children, no family nearby, reputation already." She stopped herself just short of the word she'd been building toward, which was the most honest thing she'd done since arriving. Already complicated. You need alliances, Mrs. Holt. Friends. You need the community behind you. Maggie was quiet for a moment. She looked at Ruth Decker and she saw, beneath the careful dress and the careful speech and the careful hands around the coffee cup, something she hadn't expected to see. She saw fear. Not of Maggie. Something older than that. The specific fear of a woman who had once not had the things she now had, and lived every day with the knowledge that those things could be taken. Ruth Decker was not a cruel woman, Maggie realized. She was a frightened one. And frightened people did cruel things constantly, with the best of intentions, because protecting what they had required deciding who was safe to let close. "Mrs. Decker," Maggie said gently, because she understood this woman, even though she didn't like what she was doing. "I appreciate you coming. I mean that." She set her cup down. "And I understand what you're offering. Community. Standing. A way in." She paused. "But I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Ruth lifted her chin slightly. "All right? Has Eli Holt ever once done a dishonest thing to anyone in this valley?" Silence. "Has he cheated anyone? Taken something that wasn't his? Hurt someone who didn't deserve it?"
Ruth's jaw shifted. The disputes over his own water, his own land, filed legally, argued legally. Maggie held her eyes. The discharge was for refusing to participate in a massacre, which means the only thing this town is actually holding against Eli Holt is that he has a conscience, and it cost him. She kept her voice even. I've been married to a man without one. I know the difference. I know it in my bones now. She stood and began clearing the cups, not unkindly. You're welcome here any time, Mrs. Decker. My door is open. But I won't distance myself from my husband to make other people comfortable. I've done enough of that in my life. Ruth Decker left 20 minutes later. She was not angry, which surprised Maggie. She was thoughtful, which surprised her more. Eli had been in the barn during the visit. When he came in for lunch and Maggie told him about it, he went still in that particular way of his. Not cold, just very contained. She'll report back to McAllister, he said. I know. Everything you said. I know that too. He looked at her. You weren't afraid of the consequences. I was, she said honestly. I said it anyway. She put his plate in front of him. That's not the same as not being afraid. He looked at his plate. He looked at her. He said, Thank you. And it was the plainest 2 words she had ever heard, carrying no decoration and no performance, just the full weight of a man who had spent 3 years watching people choose the easier direction and had stopped expecting anything different. She sat across from him, and they ate, and she did not tell him how much that thank you had cost her to receive, because some things needed to be kept private a little longer. It was 3 days after Ruth Decker's visit when Eli told her at supper that he was riding north the next morning. Thomas Bear Runner, she said, not a question. I need to know what he knows about McAllister's Eastern holdings. There's been movement. I heard from a trapper last week that McAllister's been in conversation with a land company out of St. Louis. If he's bringing outside money in, the timeline changes. I can't wait him out anymore. Clara looked up from her plate. You're leaving? Eli looked at her steadily. 2 days, maybe 3. Clara's face did the thing it did, the careful closing, the drawing in, the fortress going up. Maggie watched it happen and felt helpless, because she knew what her daughter was doing, and she knew why, and she could not stop it from the outside. But then Eli said, Clara. Clara looked at him. I'm coming back, he said. Not gently, not with the performed reassurance of an adult who wants a child to stop being upset. Just directly, the way he said everything. I know you've had people leave and not come back. I know that's made leaving feel permanent. So I'm telling you plainly, I will be back in 3 days. And while I'm gone, I need you to help your mother. I always help my mother, Clara said, and there was an edge in it, a child's defense of something sore. I know you do, he said. You've been helping her since before you should have had to. But this time, I mean the other kind of help. He looked at her with complete seriousness. Not the responsible kind. The regular kind. Keep Lily from chasing the hens. Make sure your mother eats something at noon because she forgets when she's working on the books. And, he paused, talk to her. Not about problems. Just talk. She needs that more than she lets on. Clara stared at him. Maggie stared at him. Lily said, I don't chase the hens on purpose. They just go where I go. Nobody addressed this. Can you do that? Eli asked Clara. Clara looked at him for a long moment with those old, careful eyes. Then something in her face changed. Not completely, not all at once. But something shifted, and what came through in the space it left was not trust exactly, not yet, but the willingness to consider it. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Good. After supper, Maggie put Lily to bed and came back down to find Clara still at the table and Eli by the stove checking his saddlebags for the morning. Clara watched him work with that focused attention she gave everything, and Maggie sat at the table and did not intervene, because something was happening, and intervening would break it. "Why does he hate you?" Clara asked Eli. Eli didn't look up from the saddlebag. "McAllister?" "Yes." "Because I won't move," he said simply. Most people, when someone with power and money and a badge pushes them long enough, they move. They decide it's not worth it. They take what they're offered and go somewhere else. He buckled the bag. I didn't. And that makes him look weak in front of people who are watching him to decide whether to do the same.
Clara thought about this. "My papa used to do things like that," she said. "Make people feel like they had to do what he said." Eli looked at her then. "He used to say," Clara continued, in the flat, careful voice of a child reporting something she had spent a long time processing, "that everyone had a price, that you just had to find it." "Some men think that," Eli said. "Don't you?" "No." He said it without elaboration, without speech. Just no. Settled and complete. Clara looked at her hands. "How do you know who to trust?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down in the chair across from her, which was not something Maggie had seen him do with Clara before. Sit down and make himself small. Come down to her level. "You watch what people do when it costs them something," he said. "Not what they say, not how they explain themselves. What they actually do when doing the right thing is harder than doing the easy thing." He held her gaze. "That's the only way I know." Clara was quiet. Then, "Mama said Papa never did things that cost him anything." "Your mama is a smart woman." "She said that about you," Clara said, not looking up. "Not in those words, but I heard her." The kitchen was very still. "Go to sleep, Clara," Maggie said from across the room, her voice doing something she could not entirely control. Clara went up the ladder without argument, which was itself a kind of answer. Eli left before dawn. Maggie heard him in the dark, the quiet, efficient sounds of a man packing a horse in the cold, and she lay in bed and listened, and did not get up, because she had told herself she was not going to make this into something it wasn't yet. The sound of hooves faded north. The first day without him was fine. Maggie worked, the girls helped, Lily fed the hens with great ceremony, and Clara did her lessons at the table, and they ate supper and went to bed, and everything was ordinary. The second day was harder. Not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The weather held. The animals were fine. The house was quiet and warm and exactly as it had been. But the absence of him, the specific, shaped absence of a person whose habits had already become part of the texture of a place, sat in the room like something tangible. She caught herself listening for the barn door in the morning. She caught herself setting 4 places at the table before she remembered. She caught herself at the basin in the evening, standing with her hands in the water and staring at nothing, and understanding suddenly, clearly, with the precision of something she had been not knowing for 2 weeks, that she was in trouble. Not the bad kind. The kind that comes when something you decided not to want turns out to be something you want so much that deciding doesn't help anymore. She dried her hands. She stood very still. Then she took the lamp and she went out to the barn. She had known she was going to do this eventually. She had known it since the first night. She unhooked the lamp from the post inside the door, and she walked to the far corner and she lifted the canvas. The cradle was exactly as she'd found it the first night. Cedar, hand-sanded, beautifully made. The kind of object that carries in it the full weight of the intention behind it. But now she looked at it differently. Now she knew about Eleanor, who had left. She knew about 3 years of McAllister,
and a man who had kept working and kept building and kept showing up to a life that had given him very little reason to keep showing up. She crouched down beside it and ran her hand along the edge the way Clara had run her hand along the fence rail. Tentative at first, and then with full intention. Eli Holt had built this for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Had kept building it after the person he'd imagined for that future walked away. Had covered it with canvas, but not thrown it away because he was, as he had said, not a man who threw things away. She thought about James Calloway, who had thrown everything away and smiled while doing it. She thought about the sound of a horse going north before dawn. She stayed there in the barn with her hand on the cedar cradle for a long time, and she let herself feel it, all of it, the fear and the wanting and the grief for the years she'd lost, and the terrifying, fragile, stubborn thing that kept insisting on being felt despite every practical reason she had given it not to be. She didn't cry. She had said long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, and she still believed that, mostly. But she stayed there a long time, and when she finally stood and covered the cradle again and went back inside, she was different in some small way she couldn't have named but could absolutely feel. On the third day, late afternoon, she heard hooves in the yard. She was at the table with the account book when Clara appeared at the door, with a look on her face that was trying hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "He's back," Clara said. Maggie looked up. "He's back, and there's someone with him," Clara continued. "A man. Native. He's—" She paused. "He's looking at the house like he's deciding something." Maggie closed the account book. She stood. She straightened her apron. She went to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch. Eli was dismounting in the yard. Beside him, on a dark horse, sat a man perhaps 60 years old, with a face like carved flint and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He looked at the house. He looked at the porch. He looked at Maggie standing on it, with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin level. Then he looked at Eli. "This is her," he said, not a question. "This is her," Eli confirmed. Thomas Bearrunner looked back at Maggie with the particular penetrating attention of a man who has spent a lifetime reading situations that other people missed. And he took his time about it. And she held his gaze and did not look away, because she understood instinctively that looking away would mean something she did not intend. Finally, he said, "She'll do." Eli's mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "I thought so. What did McAllister do while you were gone?" "I'll tell you inside," Maggie said. "Come in. There's coffee." Thomas Bearrunner looked at her for another moment. Then he dismounted with the ease of a man who had been on and off horses his entire life, and he walked toward her porch. And something in his bearing as he came told her that whatever he and Eli had ridden back with, it was significant. The fight for this land was not over. It was, she was beginning to understand, just now becoming real. But Eli was back. He was standing in her yard, looking at her with that contained, careful look of his, and she met his eyes across the distance, and she saw in them, just briefly, just for a moment, the same thing she had been sitting alone with in a barn the night before. Neither of them said a word about it. They didn't need to. Not yet. But it was there. It was real. And it was not going away. Thomas Bearrunner drank his coffee the way he did everything else, without hurry, without waste, with the full attention of a man who had decided long ago that partial attention was an insult to whatever was in front of him. He sat at the table, and he looked at the account book Maggie had left open, and he looked at the list she'd made of McAllister's movements during the 3 days Eli had been gone, and he did not speak for a long time.
Lily watched him from across the table, with the unblinking focus she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand through sheer observation. Clara sat close to Maggie, not quite touching, but close enough that Maggie could feel the warmth of her. "He came twice," Thomas said finally, looking at the list. "The first day and the third," Maggie confirmed. "First time he brought the affidavit again. Said he needed Eli's signature on an acknowledgement of receipt. I told him Eli was away on ranch business and he could come back when Eli was home." "He accepted that?" "He didn't like it, but he accepted it." She paused. "The second time he didn't bring paperwork. He brought a woman from town. Introduced her as the wife of the territorial land assessor. Said they were doing a courtesy call. Wanted to see the property." Eli looked up from his coffee. "He brought a land assessor's wife?" "He wanted eyes on the property with someone official, adjacent to document whatever they saw. I invited them in for coffee, and I sat them at this table, and I talked about the weather and the garden and how well the hens were laying for 45 minutes until they gave up and left." Thomas Bearrunner made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was brief and contained, and it transformed his face for just a moment into something younger. 45 minutes of hens. "I can talk about hens for considerably longer than that, if the situation requires it," Maggie said. Eli was looking at her with that expression she was learning to read, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. He looked away before she could look at it too long. "What did you find?" she asked him. He set down his cup. He and Thomas exchanged a look, the kind between people who have known each other long enough to conduct full conversations in a glance. "McAllister's been corresponding with a land company called Meridian Holdings," Eli said. "Based in St. Louis. They've been buying up water rights across 3 territories: New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona. Small purchases, individual deals. Nothing that looked like a pattern until you laid them all out together." "Thomas has contacts," Maggie said, understanding. "Thomas has been watching this longer than I have," Eli said, and the respect in his voice when he said it was the unself-conscious respect of a man who knew the difference between his knowledge and someone else's, and didn't feel diminished by the comparison. Thomas leaned forward. "Meridian Holdings is not a land company. It is a front. Behind it are 3 men, 2 of them with seats in the territorial legislature. They are building toward a single purchase, a consolidated water monopoly across the Eastern Valley system. Every small acquisition McAllister has made in the last 4 years feeds into it." He looked at Maggie directly. "Your husband's land is the last piece." The kitchen was very still. "If they get this property," Maggie said slowly, "they control the water for how many families?" "Every farm and ranch that relies on the Eastern Creek system," Eli said. 30, maybe 40 families. McAllister could charge whatever he wanted for access. Drought year, they'd have no choice but to pay. "Or sell," Thomas said, "at whatever price he offered." Maggie sat back. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about 30 families. She thought about women waking up in the morning and building fires and feeding children in houses that had taken years to build, not knowing that the water under their land was already spoken for by men in St. Louis who had never set foot in New Mexico territory. She thought about James Calloway's land scheme and the families in Independence who had lost everything to it. People she had looked in the face afterward when she went to the market. People whose eyes had done something complicated when they saw her coming. She had spent 2 years carrying the weight of what her husband had done to strangers. She was not going to sit at a table and let something similar happen and do nothing about it. "We need to expose it," she said. "Yes," Eli said. "Not just fight it legally. Expose it. Make it public. Names, documents, the full shape of what they're building." She looked at Thomas. "Have the documentation?"
Enough to show the pattern, Thomas said. Not enough to prove the legislative connection. For that we need the correspondence between McAllister and the two legislators. Which is in his office, Eli said. Or his house. Can we get it legally? Through the court, with a proper complaint filed by someone with standing. Thomas looked at Eli. You have standing. You're a named party in his actions. Samuel Brennan, Eli said. He's the only lawyer in Cimarron who isn't connected to McAllister. He's also the only lawyer in Cimarron who's turned McAllister down twice, Maggie said. Both men looked at her. Ruth Decker mentioned it when she was here. She didn't mean to. It came out when she was explaining why the banking community was nervous about McAllister's recent activities. Brennan refused to notarize 2 documents for him last spring. Thomas looked at Eli. She listens well. She does, Eli agreed. I'm in the room, Maggie said, without heat. We know, Thomas said, and this time the not-quite laugh was clearer. He looked at her with an assessment that was different from McAllister's assessment, different from Ruth Decker's. The assessment of a man deciding not whether she was dangerous, but whether she was real. Eli tells me you have a dishonorable discharge of your own. She looked at him. I beg your pardon? Your reputation, in Missouri. He says it was your husband's crimes laid on your name. Thomas held her gaze. A punishment for someone else's choices delivered to you because you were convenient and couldn't fight back. He paused. I know something about that kind of discharge. The weight of what he was saying, the parallel he was drawing, the specific understanding behind it, moved through Maggie in a way she hadn't expected. She looked at this man across her kitchen table, and she saw, beneath the flint exterior and the careful eyes, the same particular exhaustion that she recognized in Eli, in Clara, in herself. The exhaustion of someone who had been assigned a story they hadn't written and had spent years either fighting it or carrying it. Yes, she said quietly. That's exactly what it was. Thomas nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. He finished his coffee and set the cup down, with the precise finality of a man ending one part of a conversation and beginning another. I'll ride to Brennan's office in the morning, he said. Alone. McAllister doesn't watch me the way he watches Eli. I don't exist in his accounting of threats. Something in his voice on the word accounting was dry as August grass. That has occasionally been useful. After Thomas settled into the barn for the night, Maggie and Eli sat at the table alone for the first time in 3 days. The girls were asleep. The lamp was low. The house had settled into its nighttime quiet. The particular silence of a building that has had people in it long enough to stop feeling empty. You should have told me before you left, she said. The full scope of it. The Meridian connection. I didn't know the full scope until I talked to Thomas. You knew more than you told me. He was quiet. Yes. Why? He looked at his hands on the table. Old habit. When you've handled everything alone long enough, you... He stopped. Started again. It didn't feel like protecting you. I know that's how it landed. It landed like not trusting me. I know. He met her eyes. I'm sorry. She held his gaze. She was waiting, she realized, for the follow-on, the justification, the gentle reversal, the way James Calloway used to apologize, and then spend the next 10 minutes explaining why the apology was actually unnecessary. It didn't come. Eli said, I'm sorry, and stopped. The way a man stops when he means the thing he said and doesn't feel the need to renegotiate it. Don't do it again, she said. I won't. I can handle the truth, Eli. I've demonstrated that. You have. He looked at her with that steady, gray-eyed directness. You've demonstrated about 15 things I didn't think I was going to have in this arrangement.
She felt the words land in that place behind her sternum that kept receiving things she wasn't ready for. She kept her face even. "What did you think you were going to have?" "Someone competent," he said. "Someone honest. Someone who would keep the household running and treat the work with respect." He paused. "I didn't think I was going to have someone who sat a land assessor's wife down and talked about chickens for 45 minutes while taking a full inventory of everything she noticed. Or someone who found a billing discrepancy I've been paying for 18 months in 40 minutes. Another pause, longer, and she could see him deciding how far to go. "I didn't think I was going to have someone the girls trusted, particularly Clara." "Clara doesn't trust you yet," Maggie said carefully. "Not completely." "No, but she's deciding to. That's different from just accepting a situation." He looked at the table. "It's more than I expected." She was quiet a moment, then, "What happened to your mother?" He looked up, slightly surprised by the direction. "You know how to be in a house with children," she said. "Not just around them. In a house with them. You know to knock on your own door. You know to answer Lily's questions like they matter." "You knew Clara was carrying too much before I told you." She held his gaze. "That's not instinct. That's something learned." He was quiet for a long moment. "She left when I was 9, he said finally. "She didn't have a good life with my father. She made a choice." He said it without bitterness, but without exoneration either. The flat, honest tone of a man who had processed something fully enough to report it accurately. "I raised my brother for 4 years before my father's sister took us in. He was 5 when she left. He was small, and he was angry, and he didn't understand any of it." "What happened to him?" "He's in Texas now. Has a ranch, 3 kids, writes me twice a year." A pause. "He doesn't like to talk about those 4 years. I don't push him." Maggie thought about that. About a 13-year-old boy learning to be the person who knocked on doors and answered questions and noticed when someone was carrying too much. Learning it not because someone taught him, but because a 5-year-old needed him to. "You've been the responsible one your whole life," she said. "Someone had to be." "Yes," she said softly. "Someone always does." He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the lamplight, across the plain wooden table, something that had been building for 3 weeks simply arrived, unannounced and undeniable, like water that has finally found the crack it's been working toward. Neither of them moved. "Maggie," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice was different from every other voice that had ever said it. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Not yet." He held her gaze. "All right." "It's not—" She stopped, gathered herself. "I need more time. Not because I doubt it, because the last time I trusted something that felt this certain, I spent 11 years paying for it. And I need to be sure that what I'm seeing is what's actually there, and not what I want to be there." "That's fair," he said. No argument, no pushing, no performance of patience that was actually impatience in costume. "You're not going to tell me I'm wrong to be careful?" "No." James always told me I was wrong to be careful. He called it distrust. He made it sound like a character flaw. "It's not a character flaw," Eli said. "It's evidence that you learn from experience." He stood, collected the cups, rinsed them at the basin with his back to her. "I'm not going anywhere, Maggie. We're here. We have time." She watched his back. She watched his hands in the basin. She thought about cedar and canvas, and a man who kept building things even when there was no one left to build them for. "Eli," he turned. "Thank you for coming back when you said you would." Something moved across his face.
something that was not simple to look at. "That's a low bar," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "but it's where I'm starting from." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled, and went to his bedroll. And Maggie sat at the table for a while longer and let herself feel the full, complicated weight of the evening. The fear of McAllister and Meridian Holdings, and the 30 families who didn't know what was coming. And underneath all of it, persistent and warm and terrifyingly real, the thing she'd told herself to wait on and couldn't quite stop feeling. She went to bed. She slept. The next days moved with a particular velocity of a situation that is past the point of anticipation and entered the territory of action. Samuel Brennan came to the ranch on a Tuesday, having ridden out himself rather than waiting for them to come to him, which told Maggie something about what Thomas had said to him. He was a thin man of 60, with ink-stained fingers and the precise, careful speech of someone who chose every word deliberately and expected the same courtesy in return. He sat at the table and he listened. Eli laid out the Meridian Holdings connection. Thomas produced his documentation. Maggie presented the billing records from the mercantile and her written account of McAllister's visits during Eli's absence, including the land assessor's wife and the 47 minutes, she had revised her original estimate upward, of deliberate misdirection. Brennan read everything without comment. He had a way of reading that made you feel each document was receiving individual consideration rather than being processed in bulk. When he finished, he took off his spectacles and looked at them all.
"This is enough to file," he said. "The billing records alone establish a pattern of coordinated financial pressure. Thomas's documentation shows the land acquisition timeline. Your written account of McAllister's visits while Eli was absent demonstrates ongoing intimidation of a spouse." He looked at Maggie. "You have a clear head, and you write accurately. That matters in a formal complaint." "What's the risk?" Eli asked. "McAllister will know within 24 hours of the filing. He has someone in the land office." Brennan said it without drama, just fact. "He will escalate. Whatever he's been doing carefully up to now, he will stop doing carefully." "He'll come at us directly," Maggie said. "He'll come at you directly," Brennan said, looking at her. "He already assessed you as the vulnerability. Ruth Decker's visit was his idea, not hers. He told her you were a desperate woman who needed friends and that she'd be doing a kindness." He paused. "Ruth reported back that you were not what she'd expected. She told her husband. Her husband told Brennan at the bank." The dry precision in his voice suggested he found this chain of intelligence both useful and somewhat absurd. "McAllister revised his assessment. He now considers you an obstacle." "Good," Maggie said. Brennan looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Holt, being considered an obstacle by a man like McAllister is not a comfortable position." "I've been in uncomfortable positions," she said. "I'd rather be an obstacle than invisible." Something shifted in Brennan's expression. He put his spectacles back on. "I'll have the complaint drafted by Friday," he said. "I'll need both your signatures and Thomas's sworn statement, and I'll need Eli to locate every original document related to the water easement dispute. Everything. If it exists, I want it." "It exists," Eli said. "All of it." "Then we have a case." Brennan stood. He looked at Eli. "You should know, this will take months. It will be expensive and it will be loud, and McAllister has friends who will try to make it unpleasant for your family in ways the law doesn't easily address." "We know," Eli said. Brennan looked at Maggie. "And you're prepared for that?" "Mr. Brennan," she said, "I came to New Mexico Territory with 2 daughters, 3 weeks of food money, and a name that every person in my hometown had decided meant something it didn't.
I've been dealing with unpleasant in ways the law doesn't easily address since before I got here. She met his eyes. File the complaint. After Brennan left, the three of them sat for a moment, in the particular quiet of people who have just committed to something that cannot be uncommitted. Thomas spoke first. "There is something else," he said. Eli looked at him. "McAllister's man at the land office. I know who it is." Thomas was careful, choosing his words. "It is not who Eli thinks it is." "Then who?" Eli asked. Thomas looked at the table. "Your neighbor to the north, Franklin Hess." Eli went completely still. Maggie watched him absorb it. The particular physical quality of learning that someone you considered a safe quantity has been something else the whole time. Not just betrayal, but the retroactive reordering of every interaction, every exchange, every moment you were together and one of you was not what you appeared. She recognized that feeling intimately. "How long?" Eli said, very quietly. 2 years at least, Thomas said, possibly from the beginning. Eli was quiet. He stood, walked to the window, stood there with both hands flat on the sill and his back to the room. Maggie watched his shoulders, and she understood what was happening in the space behind them, and she did not rush it. After a moment, Clara's voice came from the top of the ladder, quiet and uncertain. "Mama, is something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Maggie said, not looking away from Eli's back. "Everything is fine. Stay up there a little longer." A pause. Then Clara's footsteps retreated. Thomas looked at Maggie. She looked back at him. He nodded, very slightly, the nod of one person acknowledging to another that they are handling something correctly. "Franklin Hess has been reporting our movements," Eli said from the window, still not turning. "My trips into town. When I filed the easement response. When I—" He stopped. "When Dorothy's letter was sent to Missouri." The room understood what that meant at the same moment. "He knew you were coming," Thomas said to Maggie. "McAllister knew before you arrived." "Which means the land assessor's wife wasn't improvised," Maggie said. "He'd been planning that visit since before I stepped off the stage. He thought a woman fresh from Missouri, with your history, 2 weeks into a strange marriage, would be easier to approach than you turned out to be," Thomas said. There was something in his voice that was almost satisfaction. "He calculated incorrectly." Eli turned from the window. His face was controlled. The anger was there. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hands were slightly too still. But he was holding it with both hands, the way a man holds something that needs to be directed rather than released. "Hess comes to me," he said, "not the other way. I don't ride to his place. I don't send word. I don't let him know we know. When he comes here next, I talk to him the same way I always have." "And then?" Maggie asked. "And then we give him something to report." Eli looked at her. "Something that looks real enough to believe and will send McAllister in exactly the wrong direction, while Brennan files." Thomas looked at Maggie. "Can you write something that sounds like a real letter, but isn't?" She thought about 11 years of reading her husband's correspondence and understanding exactly how deception was constructed from the inside. "Yes," she said, "I can." Eli looked at her across the room. In his eyes was the same thing she'd seen the night before, that quiet, certain thing that neither of them had named yet. But beside it now was something else. The specific expression of a man who has been fighting alone for a long time and has just, for the first time, looked to his right and found someone standing there. Not rescued, not carried, just standing there. "All right," he said. Outside, the afternoon had gone golden and long. Somewhere in the yard,
Lily was explaining something to the hens, in a tone that suggested she'd abandoned the prohibition on communicating with them. Clara was at the fence, watching Dust, her hand resting on the rail with a looseness that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Maggie looked at her daughters through the window. She thought about 30 families and water rights, and a legal complaint that would be filed on Friday, and a neighbor who had been reporting their movements for 2 years, and a man standing in her kitchen who had said, "I'm not going anywhere," and meant it the way people meant things when they didn't have anything left to lose by being honest. She was afraid. She was clear-eyed and practical and fully aware of the shape of what was coming. But she was not facing it alone. That was new. That was so new, it still caught her off guard at odd moments, like a step that turned out to be a different height than you expected. Not dangerous, just startling. The reminder that the ground had changed. She turned back to the room. "Let's get to work," she said. And they did. The letter took Maggie 2 hours to write and 3 drafts to get right. Not because the deception was complicated, because it had to be exactly the right kind of believable. Not too convenient, not too perfectly timed, just real enough that a man like McAllister would read it and see what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. She had learned from James Calloway that the best lies were the ones that fed an existing appetite. You didn't create a new hunger. You found the one that was already there, and you fed it something that looked like what it was starving for. McAllister was starving for confirmation that Eli was weakening, that the legal pressure, the financial strain, the isolation, the months of manufactured disputes were finally doing what they were designed to do. So she wrote a letter, ostensibly from Eli to a fictional cousin in Colorado, describing a man considering his options, weighing the cost of a prolonged fight, wondering whether the land was worth what keeping it was taking from his family. She wrote it in language that sounded like Eli, short sentences, practical observations, no self-pity, but threaded through it the specific exhaustion that McAllister had been working toward for 3 years. When she finished, she handed it to Eli across the table. He read it once. He looked up. "That sounds like me." "Yes." "The part about the family, about whether the fight is fair to you and the girls." He looked at the letter again. That's what he'd want to hear. "That's why I put it there." He set it down. "If Hess reports this to McAllister before Friday, McAllister will pull back. Give us room. Think we're about to fold." "Which gives Brennan the space to file without McAllister moving to block it first," Thomas said from across the table. "And once it's filed," Maggie said, "it's public record. He can't make it disappear." Thomas looked at the letter with the evaluating attention he gave everything. "You understand that even after it's filed, this doesn't end quickly." "I know." "Months, possibly longer. He will find other pressure points." "I know that too," Maggie said. "But right now, he thinks he's winning. The moment that complaint is filed, he'll know he isn't. And a man who discovers he's been outmaneuvered by people he underestimated," she looked at Thomas, "that's when he makes mistakes." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Eli, without looking away from Maggie, "I understand now why you sent that advertisement." Eli said nothing, but Maggie felt his eyes on her, and kept her gaze on Thomas, and kept her face composed. Because some things needed to be received quietly, or they overwhelmed you. Franklin Hess came the following morning, exactly as he always did on Thursdays. Casual, neighborly, the practiced ease of a man who had been performing reliability for 2 years and had gotten very good at it. He was 50, broad-faced, with the handshake of a man who wanted you to feel his goodwill in your palm. Maggie served him coffee. Eli talked about fence repairs and the price of cattle feed. He left the letter where it could be seen from Hess's chair without being obviously displayed. On the corner of the table, partially beneath the account book, the way a thing sits when someone has been reading it and set it aside without thinking. Hess saw it. She watched him see it. The slight pause in his coffee cup, the fractional shift in his eyes. He didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough. After he left, Eli stood at the window and watched him ride back north with the still, contained expression of a man watching something he couldn't change and had decided not to waste energy fighting. "He'll be at McAllister's by noon," he said. "Good," Maggie said. On Friday, Samuel Brennan filed the complaint. By Saturday morning, half of Cimarron knew. By Sunday, the other half had opinions about it. Maggie learned this because Ruth Decker came to church. She had brought the girls for the first time, Eli standing at the end of the pew with the deliberate presence of a man who had decided that visibility was now a strategy rather than an exposure. And Ruth Decker slid in beside her during the opening hymn and murmured, without looking at her, "You should know that my husband reviewed McAllister's accounts last week, at the bank's initiative, not his request." Maggie kept her eyes on the hymnal. And Gerald has certain obligations as a banker that supersede his social obligations. A pause. He'll be sending a letter to the Territorial Land Office by Wednesday. Maggie turned to look at her. Ruth Decker was staring straight ahead, her hands folded on the hymnal in her lap. Her face composed in the careful expression of a woman who has made a decision that cost her something and was not going to discuss the cost. "I told you when I came to your house that you needed alliances," she said. "I was right. I simply misjudged which direction they needed to point." After the service, 3 women Maggie had never spoken to introduced themselves. The wife of a rancher whose eastern fence line abutted the creek system. A widow who ran a small farm 2 miles north of town. A school teacher from the territorial school who had been fighting for 2 years to get proper supplies funded through the county office that McAllister's ally controlled. They didn't make speeches. They shook her hand and told her their names, and looked at her with a specific expression of people who have been waiting for something to tip and have just felt it begin to move. Eli stood nearby and let Maggie work, which was exactly right, because this was her territory in a way it wasn't his, and he understood that. He talked to the men, the ranchers, the farmers, the ones who had been watching his legal dispute with McAllister from a careful distance and calculating their own exposure. Thomas was not there, because Thomas's presence at a white church in Cimarron would have been a distraction from the message, and Thomas had said so himself the night before, with the dry pragmatism of a man who had long ago made peace with navigating a world built around other people's comfort. On the ride home, Clara sat beside Maggie on the wagon seat instead of in the bed with Lily. "Mrs. Decker was talking to you," she said. "She was. She doesn't seem like she likes you." "I don't think it's about liking," Maggie said. "I think she made a choice that was harder than the other choice she could have made." Clara thought about that. "Is that what being good is? Choosing the harder thing?" "Sometimes," Maggie said. "Sometimes being good is just showing up to the easy thing consistently. It depends on the situation. How do you know which situation you're in?" Maggie looked at her daughter. "You usually know," she said. "You just don't always want to." Clara was quiet for a moment. Ahead of them, the ranch came into view in the afternoon light. "Mama," she said. "Yes?" "I think he's good," Clara said, not looking at her, looking straight ahead at the ranch, at the barn, at the figure of Eli already dismounted and leading the horses toward the corral. "I've been watching, like you said. I've been watching what he does when it costs him something." She paused. "He does the harder thing, every time, even when nobody's looking." Maggie's throat tightened. "I know," she said.
"I just wanted to tell you," Clara said, "in case it helped." It helped. It helped in a way that Clara, at 9 years old, could not entirely understand, and that Maggie, at 34, could not entirely articulate. It helped the way a key helps when you've been standing outside a door for a long time. Not because the door was locked, but because you'd been telling yourself you weren't sure it was the right door. McAllister moved against them on a Wednesday, not with a legal filing, not with another courtesy visit. He moved the way Brennan had predicted, directly and without the earlier carefulness, and he moved against the water. The eastern creek that fed Eli's land and 3 neighboring properties was dammed overnight. A crude but effective blockage, placed upstream on a section of land that McAllister had quietly acquired 18 months earlier through the Meridian Holdings shell, and which none of them had known about until Thomas found it in the acquisition records. Eli discovered it at first light when he went to check the animals. He came back inside with a face that told Maggie everything before he said a word. "He dammed the creek," she said. "Upstream, maybe a quarter mile." He went to the gun case, unlocked it, stood there for a moment, not reaching for anything, just standing there with his hand on the wood of the case, deciding. "Don't," Maggie said. He turned. "That's what he wants," she said. "He wants you to ride up there angry, with a rifle, so he can say you were threatening. So the response to the legal complaint becomes a story about an armed man with a dishonorable discharge threatening a county deputy over a water dispute." She crossed the room to him. "He's been waiting for you to do something physical since the beginning, because that's the one thing he has that's bigger than your legal case." Eli's jaw was tight. She could see the effort it took, not because he was a violent man, but because he was a man who had built this land and worked it alone for 3 years, and loved it with a specific, wordless love of someone who had poured everything they had into a piece of ground, and watched it become the only thing standing between them and complete loss. "He won't keep it damned long," she said. "He can't. The families downstream have the same rights you do. The moment they file—" "They won't file," Eli said. "They're afraid of him." "They were afraid of him," Maggie said, "before last Sunday." She held his eyes. "Give me today." He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to visit 3 families," she said. "I'm going to tell them exactly what's happening, what's upstream, who owns it, and what Brennan's complaint already documents. And I'm going to ask them to add their names to a collective filing that makes this not about one man with a dishonorable discharge, but about the Eastern Valley water system and every family that depends on it." "They might say no." "Some of them might," she said, "but some of them won't. Because people who are afraid will stay afraid until someone they trust decides not to be afraid first. That's how it works." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. The same thing she'd been watching move in his face for weeks, building toward the surface like water finding its level. "Maggie," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. But let me do this first. Let me do this, and then we'll—" She stopped. "One thing at a time." He nodded. He closed the gun case. He locked it. She took the wagon. Clara rode with her because Clara had asked to come, and Maggie had said yes because her daughter was 9 years old and had been small and careful and held in for too long, and it was time she saw what her mother looked like when she moved without fear. They visited Margaret Turcotte first, the widow with the farm 2 miles north, who listened at her door with her arms crossed and her face guarded, and then, halfway through Maggie's account of the Meridian Holdings documentation, uncrossed her arms. Then Will Stanton, the rancher with the eastern fence line, who said nothing for a full minute after Maggie finished, and then said, "I knew something was wrong with those easement filings. I knew it, and I didn't push because I didn't think I could win." And then the Galvez family, 3 miles out, who had arrived from Texas 4 years ago and built their farm from raw land, and whose water access ran through the same creek system, and who had been receiving the same manufactured pressure from McAllister's office that Eli had been receiving, just quieter, because they had even less legal standing to fight back, and McAllister knew it. Rosa Galvez looked at Maggie across her kitchen table and said, in the careful English of someone conducting a translation in real time, "You are not afraid?" "I'm very afraid," Maggie said. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't do this." Rosa looked at her husband. He looked at her. Something passed between them that needed no translation. "We sign," he said. By the time Maggie drove back toward the ranch in the late afternoon, she had 4 families committed to the collective filing. She had written statements from 3 of them, signed, witnessed by Clara, who had sat at each kitchen table with the absolute gravity of a child who understood that what she was watching mattered. She had the names of 2 more families she hadn't been able to reach who Thomas said he could contact. She was 2 miles from home when she saw the rider. He was coming from the direction of the ranch, moving fast, and for one cold moment, she felt her hands tighten on the reins, because fast riders from the direction of home meant something had happened, and she was not there. Then she recognized the horse. Dust, the young horse, the stupid one, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move, with Eli on his back, leaning forward like a man who had forgotten about patience entirely. He pulled up alongside the wagon. His face was... She had never seen his face exactly like this. Open, unguarded, the specific expression of a man who has been holding something for so long that putting it down changes the shape of his whole body. "Thomas rode to Brennan," he said, slightly out of breath. "The territorial governor's office sent a letter. They received our complaint and 3 supporting documents from Gerald Decker's bank. They're launching a formal investigation into Meridian Holdings and McAllister's land acquisitions." He looked at her. "They're sending a federal land agent. McAllister has been told to cease all activity regarding disputed properties pending the investigation." Clara made a sound beside Maggie. Not a word, just a sound, small and sharp, like something that had been held too tight, finally releasing. Maggie sat with it for a moment. She let it move through her. The relief, the exhaustion behind the relief, the full weight of what had been held and could now, slowly, begin to be set down. "The dam?" she asked. He had it cleared by noon, before the letter even arrived. Eli's eyes were steady on her. He knew. Hess must have told him the collective filing was coming. So he moved first to look cooperative. Doesn't matter how it looks. The investigation is opened. Brennan says once federal land agents start pulling Meridian's acquisition records, the legislative connection will surface. It's not a matter of if anymore. Maggie nodded. She took a slow breath. She looked at the road ahead, at the ranch coming into view, at the ordinary beauty of a place she had arrived at 6 weeks ago as a stranger, and now could not imagine leaving. "You rode out to tell me," she said. "I didn't want you to come home to it second-hand." She looked at him on that young horse, slightly disheveled, entirely unguarded. And she thought about what it meant that his first instinct when good news arrived was to ride out and find her. Not to wait, not to let her come home and discover it, to ride out and find her and tell her face to face because she had earned that, because they had done this together, because that was how it worked between people who had decided to be honest with each other, regardless of what it cost. "Eli," she said. "Yes?" "I need you to take Clara home." She glanced at her daughter. "I'll be right behind you. I need a few minutes." Clara looked at her with those old eyes. Then she looked at Eli. She climbed from the wagon seat to Dust's back behind Eli,
with the careful confidence of a girl who had been learning to trust her own weight in new places. And Eli turned the horse toward home, and Maggie watched them go. She sat in the wagon alone on the road and let herself feel everything she had been managing for 6 weeks. The fear she'd ridden in on. The 2 years before that. The specific grinding exhaustion of being responsible for everything. Of never being allowed to be uncertain. Of smiling at her daughters every morning with the steadiness she manufactured because they needed it, and she was the only one there to provide it. She let herself feel it, and then she let it go. Not all at once, not forever. But she opened her hands and stopped gripping it so hard. The way you stop gripping something once you understand you're allowed to put it down. Then she picked up the reins and drove home. Eli was in the yard when she arrived. He took the horses without a word, and she went inside, and Clara was at the table writing in her school book, and Lily was asleep on the settee with her boots still on, and the lamp was lit, and the stove was warm, and the house smelled like coffee and the cedar of the walls, and the specific combination of things that meant home. She hung up her coat. She stood in the center of the room. Eli came back in. He stood near the door, reading her the way he had learned to read her. Not intrusively, just attentively. The focused care of a man who had decided that paying attention was the most important thing he could offer. "Clara," Maggie said, "take your sister up to the loft." Clara looked up from her school book. She looked at Maggie. She looked at Eli. She was 9 years old, and she missed nothing. She closed her school book and gathered Lily from the settee with the practiced ease of a big sister, and she carried her to the ladder and got them both up without waking her, and she did not ask any questions, which was itself a kind of grace. The loft went quiet. Maggie looked at Eli across the room. "I went to that barn," she said, 3 nights ago, while you were gone. I looked at the cradle. He was very still. "You built it for a future you didn't know the shape of yet," she said. "And then the shape you thought it was going to be walked away, and you covered it up, but you didn't throw it away." She crossed the room toward him. "Because you're not a man who throws things away. You told me that the first night." "I remember." "I've been throwing things away for 2 years," she said. "Piece by piece. Every time something hurt too much to keep carrying. I threw away the idea that I could read people. I threw away the idea that I deserved a home that was mine. I threw away—" Her voice caught, just once, briefly. She steadied it. "I threw away the idea that a man could look at me and see something worth staying for and mean it." He said nothing. He waited. "I don't want to throw those things away anymore," she said. "I want to be done with that. I want to stop getting up every morning and deciding how much I'm allowed to want." She was standing very close to him now, looking up at his face, at those gray eyes that had been honest with her from the first day, even when honesty was inconvenient, and sometimes especially then. "I know it's only been 6 weeks." "I know that too," he said. "I know there's still McAllister and the investigation and months of things we can't see yet." "I know that too. And I know I'm not easy," she said. "I'm careful and I'm stubborn, and I spent 11 years learning to distrust the exact thing I'm standing here telling you I want." "Maggie." His voice was low and certain. "I know." "Then you should also know," she said, "that when you rode out to find me this afternoon, instead of waiting for me to come home, that was the moment. That was the thing that did it." She looked at him steadily. "Not the cradle, not the carved horses, not any of the things that were already wonderful. Just you, riding out on that stupid horse to tell me good news to my face because you didn't want me to hear it secondhand." She paused. "That's the thing I didn't know I was waiting for." He reached up and touched her face. Just his hand, against her cheek,
the work-scarred, careful hand of a man who had built things his whole life and had learned exactly how much pressure was too much. She leaned into it. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy," he said. "I know." "I'm not going to tell you I won't get things wrong." "I know that too." "But I'm going to tell you," he said, and his voice had that quality it got when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time and had been waiting for the right moment to say, "that I have not wanted anything in a long time." I had closed that off. I thought it was better, cleaner, to just work and keep the land and not want anything that could be taken. His thumb moved against her cheek. "You walked into my house, and in 3 days you found a billing discrepancy I've been paying for 18 months, defended me to a woman I'd never been able to get through to, and looked at that cradle in my barn and understood what it meant without me having to explain it." He looked at her. "I started wanting things again before I had permission to." She closed the distance. She kissed him the way she did everything now, deliberately, without apology, with the full weight of a woman who had finally decided that wanting something good was not the same as being foolish. His hand moved from her cheek to her hair, and she felt a particular quality of his stillness become something else. The stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not allowed himself to imagine arriving, and is standing very carefully in it, trying not to break it with too much movement. They stood together in the lamplight, in a house that was both of theirs now, not just in legal fact, but in the deeper sense, the sense of two people who have mixed their worries and their mournings and their children and their fears together until the mixture is something neither of them could separate back out. Upstairs, Clara's voice drifted down, very quiet, reading to Lily from the book she'd been working through. Something ordinary and soft, a child's voice filling the dark spaces of a house that had been silent for too long. Eli pulled back just enough to look at her face. She looked back at his. "The cradle," she said. "What about it?" "Bring it inside." He looked at her. She watched him understand what she was saying, not just the words, but everything underneath them, the future they were choosing, the life they were building from the material of everything they'd survived, his losses and hers, his walls and her wariness, all of it transformed by 6 weeks of choosing honesty over comfort, presence over safety, each other over the much easier option of staying closed. "You sure?" he asked. "It's too early to—" "It's not for now," she said. "It's for later. It's because I want to look at it and know what it means." She held his eyes. "It means something good is coming. It means we built this solid enough to hold more." She touched his face the way he had touched hers. "Bring it inside, Eli. Let it be in the house where it belongs." He left and came back with the cedar cradle in his arms, carrying it the way you carry something sacred, carefully, with full attention, with both hands. He set it in the corner near the stove where the lamplight found it and made the wood glow. It was the most beautiful thing in the room. Maggie stood beside him, and they looked at it together, and the house was quiet around them, except for the sound of their daughters overhead, and the fire in the stove, and the New Mexico night pressing against the windows. This was what they had built. Not the legal case, not the victory over McAllister, not even the love that had found them both despite every reason it shouldn't have. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But what they had really built was simpler and harder than any of it. Two people who had been broken by the world's particular cruelties had chosen, every single day, to be honest with each other, to show up for each other, to stay, and in the staying had made something that neither of them could have made alone. Margaret Calloway had stepped off a stagecoach in Cimarron with nothing left she was willing to lose. And she had found, in a man nobody wanted, and a house built for one, and a cedar cradle covered in canvas, something she had stopped believing existed. Not rescue, not the end of hard things, just someone to face the hard things with, standing exactly where they said they'd stand, every single time. That was everything. That was more than enough. That was the whole of it. And it was finally, completely, irrevocably hers.